Of all the punk rock household names to come out of the early LA hardcore scene, there's one that sticks out in my mind as one of the most intense bands to ever happen to music. Known for their fast-paced instrumentals, shouty vocals, and rabidly energetic live shows, I think you could say these guys were more than a force to be reckoned with back in the day. And all of that was glued together by a strikingly positive attitude for punk of the time, focusing their message on having a good time partying with your friends and making the most out of whatever it was that excited you in life. And even though most of their songs clock in at only a minute or less, their legacy spans over generations of punk and overall rock musicians alike, forever leaving a mark on music with the whip of their unmatchable energy. How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and today I am very excited to be talking to you all about the one and only LA punk legends, the Circle Jerks. As usual, I'll be taking you all through the history of the Jerks, starting off with their beginnings at the tail end of their time with other noteworthy LA punk bands, all the way up to their current place in music today. That is, of course, with a little bit of added trivia and some of my personal thoughts on the Circle Jerks along the way. Before we get started, I want to let you all know that I made a Spotify playlist of some of my favorite Circle Jerks songs, and if you're interested, you can find a link to it in the description below. Secondly, I of course have to give a shout out to my wonderful Patreon supporters. Thank you guys so much for all the support. I've got some bonus content up on there, and any and all donations are hugely appreciated. And finally, if you are interested in seeing videos about punk rock, then may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. But before we dive in, I want to let you all know that this video is sponsoring the second annual Shocktoberfest. Shocktoberfest is the Pacific Northwest's one and only Halloween punk festival put on by Everett Punk and Metal and Robot Monster Inc. And this year it's going to be taking place at Tony V's Garage in Everett, Washington, and will be split up into 2 nights on Friday, October 24th and Saturday, October 25th. And Shocktoberfest has got quite the lineup coming up this year, with Northwest staples including Evelyn's Casket, 38 Coffin, Hades Machine, and much more, along with 2 full cover sets on the first night where you can see Damned I'm Cramped perform music by the Cramps and the Damned with Doc from the Dead Vampires, and Evelyn's Casket will be channeling the original Misfits for the 2nd year in a row. And if all that is still not enough spook for you, then I thought I'd let you know that the one and only Nim Vin will be headlining the 2nd night. This year we'll also be hosting the festival's 2nd annual costume contest, which just like last time will provide a $200 cash prize to the winner. And last but not least, I thought I'd throw in that my band Me Grimlock will be performing on the show's 2nd night, and just like our friends at Everett Punk and Metal and Robot Monster, we would love to see you there. You can find links to the Facebook event and Eventbrite ticket page in the description below, and right now the pre-sale tickets are going for $15 for a single day and $25 for a 2-day pass. Anyways! As I'm sure a lot of us probably already know, the story of the Circle Jerks begins at the end of vocalist Keith Morris' time singing for the Hermosa Beach hardcore pioneers Black Flag. Towards the end of 1979 and the band's 3rd year together, Keith would start to lose interest in where things were going, and especially so as they continued to run into confrontation with the LAPD at their shows. And as their controversial reputation made playing live more and more difficult, Keith would occasionally find himself skipping out on practices to go see other bands play. Well, this would of course create some conflict between him and the other members of Black Flag, eventually resulting in them all deciding Keith should step down as their frontman. It would introduce him to a guitarist and another avid showgoer by the name of Greg Hetson, who at the time also played for another LA band called Red Cross. Now, Keith and Greg got to know each other pretty well from hanging out and going to shows, but although they were both musicians, they wouldn't toss around the idea of starting a band together until Greg's friend Keith, or Lucky Learer, came into the picture. Greg knew Lucky through his older brother Chet, who at the time played for another LA band a lot of you guys have probably heard of called Wasted Youth. And at one point, Lucky had even tried out for Red Cross. But although he didn't land the gig with them, it didn't stop him and Greg from becoming fast friends. And once the two of them were regularly hanging around with Keith Morris, it became pretty apparent to the 3 guys that starting their own band might be worth a shot. After all, the only things they needed now was to recruit a bass player and write a few songs. And with the musical skills and scene connections they already had from previous projects, it probably wouldn't take them very long to make either of those happen. But while they were in the process of panning things out with the new band, the guys continued to go to shows for fun and inspiration. And as the Southern California punk circuit became more and more intertwined with the newly blossoming skateboarding scene, they noticed the crowd participation was becoming a lot more intense, with fans trading in the pogo or jumping dances for the more group-oriented and high-octane slam dancing, or what we now might think of as moshing. But field trips aside, the guys were of course very eager to get to writing as soon as they possibly could, and Keith, Greg, and Lucky decided to craft music that would be best suited for these rowdier audiences, composing short, rapidly paced instrumentals which perfectly complemented the untamed energy of the mosh pits but also didn't draw on so long that it wore out the crowd. And as they paired it with Keith Morris's powerful, snarly vocals, before they knew it, the band had a sound that was made to be slammed to. And as fate would have it, the guy's avid show attendance would eventually introduce them to a bass player named Roger Rogerson, finally filling out their lineup to the 4 pieces they needed to start playing shows. And by January of 1980, they were all but ready to take the LA punk scene by storm. The guys would find themselves a band name through an old 60s slang dictionary that Keith's friend Raymond Pettibone had lying around his house, stumbling across the phrase circle jerk and getting a kick out of its both shocking and humorous nature. I'm sure a lot of you might recognize the name Raymond Pettibone as the famous punk artist responsible for nearly all of Black Flag's iconic artwork. And while we're on that subject, I just thought I'd let you know that I've done an entire video on Black Flag already, and if you're interested, you can find a link to it in the description below. But anyway, once the Jerks had a name, lineup, and setlist, like most hungry young bands, they got to playing shows right away, quickly catching on in the ever-growing hardcore scene of the era, and also grabbing the attention of Frontier Records owner Lisa Blanche. And Lisa just so happened to already be familiar with Keith and Greg's previous work with Black Flag and Red Cross. And after she watched the band absolutely tear the house down at the Cuckoo's Nest, the Circle Jerks found themselves with a record deal and a very good reason to hop into the studio. So the band would head on down to Culver City, California's Birdcliff Studios in July of 1980 and banged out a whopping 14 tracks and a handful of short sessions over the course of a couple weeks. However, the Jerks songs were so short that they decided to leave a couple of seconds of silence in between each one, hoping that people would be more likely to buy the record if its duration appeared a little bit longer. And just for the sake of trivia, the album was actually recorded with a used tape, which gave it that grainy sound you might have noticed when you've listened to it in the past. But despite any concerns the band might have had during the process, the record proved to be a smashing success in the underground, making its debut through Frontier on October 1st of 1980 under the name Group Sex, a title all too complimentary to the band's provocative name. Interestingly enough, though, the record would include a couple of retooled tunes Keith had previously worked on with Black Flag, one of them being the famous Wasted track that appeared in a very different manner on Black Flag's debut 7-inch Nervous Breakdown. And these would be the first of several times that the guys would bring in older material they'd worked on with other bands to be recreated into Circle Jerk songs. But now that the band had a decently sized following in LA and a killer new record out, it was of course time to hit the road. And come 1981, the Circle Jerks would head out on their first few tours, squeezing in runs of both the east and west coasts of the US before the year was over, along with a couple of standalone shows down south too, scoring themselves a number of bills with some other punk favorites of the era, including Minor Threat, The Cramps, and Bobby Steele from the Misfits' new band at the time, The Undead. And while their tours were going exceptionally well, as the Circle Jerks got more and more seasoned, they of course grew more and more enthusiastic about returning to the studio. And not only that, but in the midst of their hefty show schedule, the band also scored themselves a deal with a label called Faulty Products, a division of IRS Records that had worked with several other noteworthy punk bands of the day, including the Dead Kennedys, DOA, and Anti-Nowhere League. So in December of 1981, the Jerks entered the studio once again, this time at A&M Studios in Hollywood alongside producers David Anderle and Gary Hurstius. But this time around, things would feel a little more rushed, as the Jerks only had a mere 3 days to bang out all 15 tracks they'd planned for the session, resulting in some mixed feelings from the band about the finished product, and namely that they felt it didn't come out quite as raw as they might have hoped it would. But just like last time, any internal concerns aside, the album still made its debut right on time, coming out on March 4th of 1982 through Faulty Products under the name Wild in the Streets, further solidifying the Circle Jerks as one of West Coast punk's staple names of the era. The new record included 12 brand new songs from the Jerks along with 3 covers, and interestingly enough, the album's title track and later crowd favorite Wild in the Streets was actually a punk rendition of a song written by Garland Jeffries that came out nearly a decade prior in 1973. I'll leave a link to the original song in the description below if you want to check it out, but as I'm sure you can guess, judging by the dates alone, it sounds absolutely nothing like the Circle Jerks version. As for the other 2 covers, they would come in the form of the album's final tracks, and the pair of songs would be Just Like Me and Put a Little Love in Your Heart, which were a couple of even older tunes from the 60s that were originally written and performed by Paul Revere and the Raiders and Jackie DeShannon, respectively. But whether the Jerks were playing their own songs or somebody else's, nothing was about to stop them from taking over the scene back in the day. And as they got further along into 1982, their show schedule began to pick up again, making their rounds through California and the larger West Coast, East Coast, and South once again, along with their first ever appearances in the Midwest. For as smoothly as things had gone up until this point, aside from some minor concerns in the studio, studio, the Jerks would experience their first real taste of turbulence when their plans to go on tour in the spring of 1982 conflicted with Lucky Learer's law schooling. And when they also found out he wouldn't be able to join them for the recording sessions they'd been planning to book in the UK, he and the rest of the band realized they needed to sit down and have a serious conversation, which sadly resulted in the Jerks parting ways with Lucky in 1982. The band would find their next drummer, though, in a guy named John Ingram, a friend of Roger's who he'd coerced into the band by maybe making a little too many exaggerated promises about the kinds of numbers the Circle Jerks were really pulling in. But even though he might have been a little misled at first, John still ended up sticking around for a while, and certainly long enough to find his footing within the band. And not long after he did, a lot of them would catch the attention of LAX Records, who had taken upon themselves to release the Circle Jerks' next full-length album. So after another good run of shows and some solid writing sessions, the Jerks entered the studio for the third time over the course of 2 sessions in March and December of 1983. Both of these sessions took place at Sunset Sound in Hollywood, and the band recorded 11 brand new songs along with a cover medley of a bunch of pop tunes from past decades that they called Golden Shower of Hits. The Jerks would also work alongside LAX Records owner Jerry Goldstein in the studio until the new record was ready for release on July 21st of 1983, making its debut under the same title the band had used for the cover medley, Golden Shower of Hits. But even though things had been going pretty smoothly throughout the recording process, as the Jerks began doing their usual run of shows in support of the new album, things would start to fall apart with drummer John Ingram, as he was having a pretty hard time keeping up with the band's typical fast-paced live performances out on the road. So when he eventually resigned from the Circle Jerks towards the end of 1983, the band approached none other than the former DOA and Black Flag drummer Chuck Biscuits, as he'd conveniently enough recently parted ways with Black Flag. And Chuck would of course ace his audition and only continued to knock things out of the park as he brought the energy at the Circle Jerks live shows all the way back up to top speed everywhere he went with them. But the band wouldn't just stop with a new drummer either, and as Roger grew more and more interested to switching to the role of rhythm guitar, the Jerks also recruited a bass player named Earl Liberty, a friend of Chuck Biscuits who'd played with the band Saccharine Trust that toured with Black Flag while Chuck was still in that band. And now with an all-star 5-piece lineup, one might be inclined to assume that the Jerks were really finding their stride, and for a while, they absolutely were. But as Roger got more and more into partying through the endless tours and shows, things would take a turn for the worst after he eventually overdosed in late 1983. Fortunately, Roger would survive the overdose, but saying he was in rough shape afterwards would be an understatement. And as he continued to drag his feet through the band's busy touring schedule, he would eventually become really moody and difficult to work with. And as things only got worse, he eventually just gave up altogether mid-tour, walking out on the Circle Jerks entirely and just kind of taking off, forcing the rest of the band to leave him behind and carry on with the rest of their commitments as a 4-piece after they were unable to find or get a hold of him the day he disappeared. But even with Roger abruptly out of the mix, the Jerks still weren't about to slow down, and they crammed in a whopping 18 tours in support of Golden Shower of Hits throughout the US. And as they continued to make quite the name for themselves in the underground touring circuit, the Circle Jerks would start to garner a bit of a reputation. And with that, they were able to help some smaller LA locals they liked get a head start when it came to playing shows. And the most noteworthy of those bands was none other than the San Fernando Valley's Bad Religion, a band that I'm sure many of you know Greg Hetson would spend a great deal of time playing and recording with over the years later on. But while we're on that subject, I just thought I'd mention I have 2 videos in a series on Bad Religion already that you can find links to in the description below if you want to check them out. Going back to the main topic at hand though, while all this touring was doing the Jerks a whole world of good, it also wasn't the only iron they had in the fire. And their reputation in the punk scene would eventually score them an invite to do some work for the 1984 film Repo Man, which if you're not familiar is a movie about a punk rocker who gets recruited by a car repossession agency and then finds himself in pursuit of a Chevy Malibu with something mysterious stashed in the trunk. The band would record an acoustic rendition of their song When Shit Hits the Fan for the movie, and the track featured a lot of them playing acoustic guitars along to a drum machine. And this, ironically enough, would also be the only Circle Jerks recording to ever feature Chuck Biscuits. But anyway, once Repo Man saw its release into theaters come March 2nd of 1984, the Jerks would find themselves with a few more interesting opportunities. And one of those opportunities was an invite to perform live on television for a show called Rock Palace on NBC, for which the band played a short set and Keith Morris dressed up as Michael Jackson. And if you're wondering, this performance is of course available on YouTube, so if you want to check it out, I've left a link to it in the description below. And I gotta say, it certainly does Chuck Biscuits a lot more justice than the recording the band did for Repo Man. But speaking of Chuck Biscuits, as 1984 pressed on, tension started to rise between him and the rest of the Circle Jerks, and things would reach a head when the band were invited to play a party show hosted by ex-guitarist and founder John Doe at Club Lingerie in Los Angeles. Being that it was a party show, the band of course weren't going to be paid for it, as I'm sure you can imagine, nobody else else on the bill was either. And when he discovered this, Chuck refused to play the show, insisting that the Jerks should be getting paid no matter what. Given that the band had already committed to play, however, Greg was forced to give Chuck an ultimatum. Either he did the show with them, or he had to leave the band. As anyone would be, Chuck was of course furious to hear this, but he didn't exactly respond in the most professional manner either, attacking Greg right on the spot. So as I'm sure you might assume, that was enough of an answer for Greg, and after giving Chuck a full force kick to the ballsack, he and the rest of the Jerks parted ways with him for good. Unfortunately, along with Chuck Biscuit's departure, or eviction so to speak, the band would also lose Earl Liberty come the end of 1984, leaving the Circle Jerks without a rhythm section for the first time since their inception. But with a reputation like theirs, it didn't take Greg and Keith very long to find themselves a pair of well-suited musicians for the gig, pulling in a drummer named Keith Clark who had ties to the metal scene, and along with his fast, tight playing, he also shared Keith Morris's fondness for the band Megadeth, who'd been making quite a splash in the LA metal scene at the time. And Keith Morris would also find the Jerks a new bass player in his friend Michael Balzery from Fear, or as the rest of the world would later come to know him, Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And these two guys gave the Circle Jerks a little bit of reimagining. And with Clark's tight metal drumming and Flea's intricate fingerstyle bass playing, I certainly would be one to assume this might have been the tightest they'd ever sounded live up until this point. But of course, this A-team wouldn't stick together forever. And as the Red Hot Chili Peppers continued down their path of becoming one of the biggest bands in the world, Flea would eventually become too busy to keep things up with the Jerks at the same time. Forced to fill the bass player slot again, and with no one on speed dial this time, the band decided to hold some auditions. And interestingly enough, the guys would find their next bassist in an actor of all people by the name of Zander Schloss. Now, Zander and the Jerks had actually met each other once before on the set of Repo Man, because if you don't know, Zander portrayed Kevin the Nerd in the movie. But upon introducing himself to the guys for the first time, they didn't exactly leave the best impression. And until he tried out for the band later on, he would recall the Circle Jerks as the grumpiest guys he'd ever met. But although first impressions can certainly leave a mark, they also, of course, can be deceiving. And in this case, I think it's pretty safe to say it went both ways. Because after Zander's audition, Keith Clark was exceptionally impressed by his playing and specifically requested the Jerks take him in as their new bass player. But while this might have caught the guys in the Circle Jerks off guard, in retrospect, I'd say it actually makes a lot of sense, as Zander's background of formal musical training at the Guitar Institute of Technology probably put him at an advantage over some of the more novice-level players who might have also tried out. And once Zander was properly inducted into the band, the four of them all got to work on getting him up to speed with the back catalog and all their new ideas. And once he was good to go, the Jerks would return to the studio once again at Crystal Studios in Hollywood, California. And there the band would lay down 13 brand new tracks with the help of producer Carrot Faye, several of which were co-written with a few guests including Tito Lariva from The Plugs and Chris Desjardins, or Chris D, from The Flesh Eaters. And after mixing and mastering were finished, the record would then make its debut through Combat Records in 1985 under the name Wönderful, with the album artwork featuring the band dressed up in tuxedos and posing on the beach with pets. After the new record dropped, the Circle Jerks would then of course continue on with their relentless touring schedule, one that they would carry on all the way into the latter months of 1986, touring relentlessly throughout the US and Canada with all kinds of noteworthy names including The Descendants, Suicidal Tendencies, The Vandals, and 7 Seconds, and the band even got themselves booked at a street festival event in LA in 1985. Amidst the chaos though, the Jerks never slowed down on their writing process, and when Keith Clark and Zander Schloss moved in as roommates, the two of them were able to speed it up even more with their late night jam sessions. So eventually, things got to the point where the band had so much new material that they were well overdue for a new release. And in 1987, the Circle Jerks got to work on their 5th full-length record. Sessions would take place with producer Carrot Faye at Crystal Studios, and the band would also sign with Relativity Records in support of its release. And this album would feature a number of tracks to come out of Zander and Keith Clark's roommate jam sessions. So many, in fact, that Keith Morris and Greg even felt like they weren't getting to contribute as much to the writing. The Jerks had also noticed a metal trend starting to take off in LA around the time they started working on the new record, and also how many punk bands and fans were starting to hop on that bandwagon. And while this did influence their writing a little bit, the Jerks weren't out to completely stray from their roots and put out a metal album, opting for a more rock-influenced punk sound instead, which resulted in a 13-track LP that featured 12 brand new tunes from the Circle Jerks, as well as a cover of Creedence Clearwater Revival's song Fortunate Son. After mixing and mastering were completed, the new album would then make its debut that same year under the title 6, even though it was only the band's 5th full-length release. And the guys in the Circle Jerks have actually joked about that in interviews and said they called it 6 with the intention of confusing people since they waited one more year than usual to drop a new album. And the Jerks kept going into 1988 with another good few tours throughout the US. But as several of the band's members became more and more involved with other projects, dysfunction would start to seep its way back in. The most obvious of these other projects is of course Greg Hetson's now full-time gig with Bad Religion, and as I'm sure a lot of you guys probably know, 1988 was also the year their legendary record Suffer made its first appearance, and that along with their heavy touring schedule throughout the US and Europe was making it a little bit harder for him to dedicate the time he needed to the Circle Jerks. But that wasn't the only offshoot endeavor going on in the late 80s, and along with his still ongoing film career, Zander Schloss would be invited by none other than Joe Strummer from The Clash to play guitar on his solo record. His first work with Joe would make its debut in 1987 in the form of a massive 17-track album called Walker, but he would eventually leave the Jerks entirely in favor of his new gig with Joe Strummer later on in 1988, and would continue on with him into the latter months of 1989, performing on Joe's sophomore record Earthquake Weather in September of that year. While we're on the subject of Circle Jerks offshoots though, I definitely have to bring up Keith Morris's band Off that he started with a few other noteworthy musicians from bands like Rocket from the Crypt and Burning Brides, but this project would come together much later on in the year 2009. But just in case you haven't heard them yet, I would definitely recommend their whole discography to anyone who considers themselves a fan of the Circle Jerks or just old school punk in general. While Zander was out of the mix though, the Circle Jerks would pull in a handful of replacement bassists, none of whom would stay very long, but when things eventually died down with Joe Strummer's solo work, Zander would eventually rejoin the band come the end of 1989. And after both he and Keith Morris got sober around the same time, the Jerks had another solid moment of optimism. But sadly, this time it wouldn't last as long as they might have hoped. And after sticking it out for one final year of tours in 1990, the Circle Jerks decided to call it quits for the first time. But as I'm sure we all know, this breakup would only be temporary, and after witnessing Nirvana's break in 1991 that brought punk into the mainstream for the first time, and then later Green Day's smash hit record in 1994, the founding members of the Circle Jerks were hit with a burst of inspiration. The band would reform themselves with their original lineup in 1994 after Keith, Greg, and Lucky all received phone calls from Roger Rogerson, who'd become extremely enthused about playing music again after discovering the success of Green Day. But even though he sounded a little bit out of it at the time, the other three guys still figured it was worth a shot and agreed to get together for some rehearsals. However, things sadly wouldn't pan out the way the band had intended them to, and after Roger failed to show up for the first of these practices, the other three members of the Circle Jerks would receive another series of phone calls from Roger's former roommate, who informed them that he'd overdosed again the night before, but this time he sadly didn't survive the OD. Well, this of course was certainly not the news anyone wanted to hear. The other three guys had still done quite a bit of work to get everything back into place to do shows again, so after a quick conversation with Zander Schloss, the band decided they ought to still give this second coming a solid try. So the Jerks got back into their writing process for the first time in a good number of years, and somewhere along the way they also scored themselves a deal with Mercury Records with the intention of helping them put out a sixth full-length record. And so, after roughly a year of writing, rehearsing, and getting everything dialed in, the band hit the studio once again in 1995 with the help of producer Nico Bolas, laying down 11 brand new tracks along with a cover of the Soft Boys song I Wanna Destroy You that would oddly enough feature some guest background vocals from singer-songwriter Debbie Gibson, and she would even perform the song with the band on a couple of occasions. After mixing and mastering were completed, the new album would then make its debut through Mercury Records on June 20th of 1995 under the name Oddities, Abnormalities, and Curiosities. And once it came out, the Jerks would also shoot a video for I Wanna Destroy You that would see a decent amount of airplay on MTV, including an appearance on Beavis and Butthead later that year. This record unfortunately isn't available on streaming, but if you haven't heard it and want to check it out, I've left a YouTube link to the full album stream in the description below. Along with releasing the record, the Circle Jerks would also do a series of reunion and support tours which saw them visit a number of cities throughout the US and Canada that they hadn't played in for several years, along with 2 back-to-back shows at CBGB's in May of 1995. But eventually, things would fall into an unfortunate lull again as tensions would rise between Greg Hetson and the rest of the band due to his extremely busy schedule with Bad Religion, who'd recently seen a massive break of their own through the success of their 1994 LP Stranger Than Fiction, and the ever-growing popularity of Brett Gurwitz's Epitaph Records. And this would sadly lead to the Circle Jerks splitting up once more towards the end of 1995. As we all know, this of course wouldn't be the end-all for the Circle Jerks, and the band would carry out several more reunions throughout the 2000s and 2010s, and as of 2019, they seem to be back to touring at a pretty active level. But instead of going through the lineage of what we might think of as the Jerks' legacy years, instead I think it's a lot more important to now focus our attention on the undeniably impressive legacy they've left behind. So I'm sure we're of course all familiar to some degree of the Circle Jerks' impact on on punk as a whole, and being one of the staple LA bands of the early 80s, I think it's pretty safe to say they left a mark on most musicians to come out of that scene. Whether they would go on to play with bands in the same decade or during the following one throughout the 90s punk explosion, or ended up somewhere else in music along the way. But the bottom line is they concocted a sound and an energy that hasn't left punk since it made its debut back in 1980. The intense, bombastic drumming, sharp, noisy guitars, and snarling vocals, these are all things that while maybe the Jerks weren't the first band to pioneer, they definitely played a pretty big role in making it stick with punk for years to come. I'd say the most obvious examples of this are probably the many other LA staples to rise up shortly after the Jerks came out, like Bad Religion, Aggression, RKL, and NoFX, but their influence would of course span on into future generations of bands as well. Like I said, I think they also left a sizable mark on the 90s scene too, and especially as bands like Pennywise, AFI, and The Offspring took elements of what the Jerks had started and refined it into a much tighter and structured format. But like most of these groundbreaking bands from the early 80s, the influence was felt much deeper than their local scenes. And I'd certainly be one to argue that the Jerks left a pretty solid mark on hardcore in general. And as we saw that genre grow further and further into its metal-infused future, you can still feel that spastic energy of the Circle Jerks buried beneath all the down-tuned guitars and crisp production. Plus, as we go further back in time through hardcore history, I think the influence becomes a lot more obvious too. Also, I think crust punk is another great example of a scene that the Jerks had a huge impact on as well. And although this one can go a little bit unnoticed at times, I would actually argue this is one of the biggest marks on punk they ever made. For one, you've got that same rabid energy with pretty much all of those bands, no matter what generation we're talking about, and there's also that similar noisy style of guitar playing as well. And while maybe the Circle Jerks might not have been as crucial to that circuit as a band like, say, Discharge or Amoebics, I still think their impact can be felt pretty much immediately upon listening, and even through more recent releases from that scene. But of course, it doesn't just stop with punk either, and I'd actually say the Jerks left a pretty solid mark on stoner rock as well. Well, this of course makes sense since a lot of those bands like the Butthole Surfers or Red Fang have some pretty deep roots in punk to begin with. In the case of the Circle Jerks specifically, I'd say again, their noisier side definitely left a pretty big impact here. Not to mention their party first, rest later attitude is another thing I think gets echoed in this scene quite a bit. And kind of like with the musical characteristics, they certainly weren't the first band to make this popular in punk or really any kind of underground rock music as a whole, but I'd still say they were one of the most impactful. And I think the stoner rock scene has the Jerks to thank for that type of mentality just as much as punk does in a lot of ways. And as I always do, I will be leaving you all with some of my personal thoughts on the Circle Jerks. For a long time, the Circle Jerks have been one of those bands that I've certainly always enjoyed, but considered myself maybe more of a casual fan. I've of course got a copy of Group Sex, and I've always loved that record, but for a while I always enjoyed them kind of on the side. But I guess you could say that all changed when I got to see them play a sold-out show in Seattle on one of their post-COVID reunion tours. My buddy Justin got some free tickets from a friend, and we ended up rolling in there for the whole show of them, the Adolescents, and Negative Approach, and god damn did the Jerks kick ass that night. Something you'll always hear people say about the Circle Jerks in documentaries and stuff is how incredible live they've always been. And I gotta say, even in their 60s, those guys are still ripping just as hard as they did in their 20s. As you can imagine, I've since become a more avid fan, diving into the rest of their catalog and loving everything I've heard, but I'm honestly really surprised with how long it took me. But I guess you could say better late than never. Well, I think that about sums up our crash course here on the Circle Jerks. I've had an absolute blast with this one, and I hope you all have enjoyed the ride too. But that's enough from me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. What's your favorite Circle Jerks record? Do you have any favorite songs? Have you ever gotten a chance to catch them live? If so, when and where? Let me know in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.